So we take it that you're getting sufficiently quiet that we should start. There are some seats down the front if some people from the back would like to come down. Anyway, thank you for everybody for coming on what is such a beautiful day. I think you're going to hear a wonderful lecture, and one of the effects of the weather will be even the feeling of warmth from the lecture will increase. And it's a very special moment for the school, and we couldn't have imagined a better person to begin something that's so special for us. As you can see from the poster, this is the inaugural Kenneth Frampton Endowed lecture. And the lecture is something that tries to go to the heart of the kind of intellectual mission of the school, and the group of architects who joined in to support this series and to make this a series that goes forever and can be published forever and can reach out and include PhD students forever. In other words, a kind of thinking machine is this sort of group, which is of course a who's who group, many of whom are in the room tonight, and it's too many people to mention. The most important point about this, this is a group of architects. It's an exciting list. But the main spirit of this is to say one of the great intellectual figures, one of the great writers of our discipline, would be supported forever by a group of his colleagues because they are architects, because he's an architect, and because what's very beautiful about his writing is the thinking of an architect. And of course, in some level, the purpose of this series is to actually continue that thinking and to intensify that thinking. So I think in any moment in time in which you can take many of the world's leading practitioners and invite them to contribute to an intellectual project that is only about a continuation of thinking, it's really a remarkable thing. And I think this is really only possible in the name of Kenneth Frampton, because this is the only name that one could think about in which the question of what it means to be an architect and what it means to think and what it means to write is so perfectly embodied. You will remember that it was exactly a year ago in which Kenneth pulled off what must be regarded as one of the greatest frauds in the history of this school. He let it be known that he was turning 80 years old, which, as you know, is biologically impossible for somebody to be looking so good, acting so good, writing so well at that age. Nevertheless, we entertained the hypothesis that he may be 80 years old. And we had an event to celebrate that. Rather than have the event discuss the beauty of Kenneth's personality, clothes, taste, and writing over the previous 80 years, the real issue was quite the opposite. Where is that writing? Where is that thinking? Where is that beauty? Where is that thought going? And only Kenneth could lead that, and he led that through this Congress held here of those architects in North America whose work was of most interest to Kenneth at that moment. And they came and spoke, and essentially they tried to show their work to Kenneth and receive his approval. And it was really an amazing event to see these extraordinarily talented architects showing their work and then sort of sheepishly looking over to Ken to see whether or not they passed. Which just goes to show for all of you students in the room that that desperate moment where you're looking for approval from a disapproving teacher, it doesn't go away. It never ends. And to the extent that you get successful, I think there's not an architect in the world who would not like Kenneth to look at their project, think about it, ask some questions, enter into the thinking of the project, and not say that you did a great thing, but have you feel that you had his interest, at least only for those 10 minutes or for those 15 minutes. And that happened in this room, and it was an extraordinarily interesting event. And the book of that event will be forthcoming, I think, in November. There are flyers for the book out the back. And Kenneth has been working with the book department here, with Craig Buckley and so on. I think it'd be a very beautiful book produced by Lars Muller. All of this is just to say that in that moment of celebrating this fraudulent claim that Kenneth is 80, 65 at best, I think, or he has access to advanced technologies that we're not aware of. This wonderful moment where the school gathered around Ken and asked the question, where is your thinking going? And Ken began by answering by pointing to the work of colleagues, pointing to other architects operating in North America, was the beginning in a way of the spirit of this Endowed lecture series, where we reached out to a group of architects and said, wouldn't you want this to happen every year and happen every year for the next 100 or 200 years? And in that sense, the idea of this lecture is the exact opposite of a memorial lecture. That is to say, it's the exact opposite of saying how great things were, what are the wonderful things that have happened. On the opposite, it was to celebrate the future direction of this thinking, or to celebrate indeed the fact that that's what thinking does. It moves forward, that all forms of reflection are also forms of action and also lead forward. And again, I invite you to consider Kenneth's work in terms of this play between the reflective and the active. It is, of course, the architect's claim, literally for thousands of years, that we should be taken seriously as intellectuals because we regard architecture as a medium for communicating the highest aspirations of society, that we, as it were, see the built environment in intellectual terms and operate as intellectuals. And every now and then you do need an intellectual to represent that capacity beyond the literal design of a building. And this, I think, is the great strength and quality of Kenneth as a person and as a thinker and as a writer. So the idea was, and very, very easily this beautiful group of architects gathered around this concept, was to make sure that every year in the school someone that, like him, straddles the world of design and the world of writing would pick up some of those themes that mattered the most to him and continue that thought, continue that reflection. Not to monumentalize those particular concepts or Kenneth's particular understanding of those concepts, but actually to honor the questions that were being examined. At one level, you can understand Kenneth's work as a kind of call for responsibility. The question is then responsibility to what and whom. There is an ethical drive to the work which is very, very relentless. So the question is how to find a group of people in perpetuity who would, as it were, keep this ethical dimension operating. This means that we have to find the best minds who will contribute to the evolution of the conversation that he not just started, but is in a way accelerating even as we speak. Ken is an absolutely unique figure. Since his office is next to mine, it would be very, very easy to intimidate any of his colleagues by telling them just how much he's producing in that office continuously. There is no hesitation in the writing. The writing is relentless. But somehow this relentless writing doesn't interfere with the possibility of accepting almost any invitation by a student or a visiting architect to meet and to talk. So there is this constant flow of people in and out of the office, which hypothetically would make no writing possible, but for Kenneth seems to be almost like a kind of nutrient to the writing itself. And inasmuch as the writing tries to bring architects together and to have them, as it were, gather around key questions of the field, it makes perfect sense to me that young and senior and distant figures and local figures are always passing through the office to, in a way, this is a really unfortunate analogy, but I was going to say to sort of drink Ken. Because the nutrient, because basically for Ken, the visitors are a nutrient, but also he's a nutrient for them. This metaphor must stop. The basic point is, and what I'm telling you is more true than you can believe. So this is a genuinely open, thoughtful, engaged figure. For those of us who come to the school from a very long distance, we somehow understood that through the writing. The closer you get, the more you understand it's never just writing. It's thinking, and it's thinking collaboratively. And in that sense, both Ken and I were thrilled that Juhani would accept the invitation to inaugurate this kind of project of thinking, and thinking again, and thinking collectively, and thinking as architects, whatever genre of practice you have assumed, the production of buildings or the production of text. Juhani, as you know, is an architect from Finland, is a former professor at the Helsinki Institute of Technology, former director of the Museum of Finnish Architecture, an enormously accomplished, gifted designer and writer. When we say architecture, I think in Juhani's case, you have to think of buildings, of landscapes, of products, of graphic design, of city plans, the whole spectrum of design. And these buildings and these projects are always somehow inseparable from a kind of intellectual pursuit of questions about space, about place, about body, about senses, about mind. And it would trivialize the work to try to summarize it in any way, but surely it's obvious to everybody in this room why it is that Ken and I thought this was the perfect person to begin this extended reflection. Juhani single-handedly, seems to me, offers a sustained reflection on the kind of phenomenological experience, and I wouldn't say experience of or in relationship to architecture, but the phenomenological experience as itself, architecture. And this, of course, is one of the threads of Kenneth's work that has been absolutely consistent and constant from the very beginning. But I read you just some titles. I mean, normally I really hate this, but I think in this case it's got to be done. Just read you the titles of books of the last 10 years, and if you listen to the sound of the titles, you understand the meaning of the invitation. The Architecture of Image, Existential Space and Cinema, 2001. The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses, 2005. Encounters, Architectural Essays, 2005. Archipelago, Essays on Architecture, 2006. Questions of Perception, The Phenomenology of Architecture, 2007. The Thinking Hand, 2009. The Embodied Image, Imagination and Imagery in Architecture, 2011. Not by accident, it seems to me, the book at the beginning is about image, and the last book was about image. And in the middle, you go deeper and deeper into the body and the hand, and then back to the image again. So this is also a thinker for whom a kind of classic opposition between embodied experience, understood perhaps as an authentic relationship to architecture, and image as disconnected, suspect in relationship to that. This is a kind of thinking that doesn't allow that kind of separation. And I think in that sense, Juhani has been a teacher and a friend to many, many people in this room. And it's really with a great pleasure that Kenneth and I welcome you to deliver the inaugural Kenneth Frampton lecture. Juhani.
Thank you, Mark, for a most generous introduction. I must also say that I feel very honored, humbled and touched to give the first Kenneth Frampton lecture. We have had a conversation for almost 4 decades now with Kenneth on various continents, and it will continue after this encounter in New York, in Lima, Peru, in a month. Let me see now. I decided to change the title of my lecture a little bit, and as it is written on my manuscript, it is Space, Place and Atmosphere, Peripheral Perception in Architectural Experience. Sorry. The quality of a space or place is not merely a visual perceptual quality, as is usually assumed. The judgment of environmental character is a complex fusion of countless factors which are immediately and synthetically grasped as an overall atmosphere, feeling, mood, or ambience. Quote, I enter a building, see a room, and in the fraction of a second have this feeling about it, unquote. Peter Zumthor, one of the architects who have acknowledged the importance of architectural atmospheres, confesses. John Dewey, the visionary American philosopher who already 8 decades ago grasped the immediate, embodied, emotive, and subconscious essence of experience, articulates the nature of this existential encounter followingly. The total overwhelming impression comes first, perhaps in a seizure by a sudden glory of the landscape, or by the effect upon us of entrance into a cathedral when dim light, incense, stained glass, and majestic proportions fuse in one indistinguishable whole. We say with truth that a painting strikes us. There is an impact that precedes all definite recognition of what it is about. The experience is multisensory in its very essence, but it also involves judgments beyond the 5 Aristotelian senses, such as the sensations of orientation, gravity, balance, stability, motion, duration, continuity, scale, and illumination. Indeed, the immediate judgment of the character of space calls for our entire embodied and existential sense, and it is perceived in a diffuse and peripheral manner rather than through precise and conscious observation. Moreover, this complex assessment also includes time, as it fuses perception, memory, and imagination. Each space and place is an invitation to and suggestion of distinct acts. In addition to environmental atmospheres, there are cultural, social, family, workplace, etc., interpersonal atmospheres. The atmosphere of a social situation can be supportive or discouraging, liberating or stifling, inspiring or dull. We can even speak of specific atmospheres in the scale of cultural, regional, or national entities. Genius loci, the spirit of place, is a similarly ephemeral, unfocused, and non-material experiential character that is closely related with atmosphere. We can indeed speak of the atmosphere of the place, which gives it its unique perceptual character and identity. Dewey explains this unifying character as a specific quality, quote, "An experience has a unity that gives it its name. That meal, that storm, that rapture of friendship. The existence of this unity is constituted by a single quality that pervades the entire experience in spite of the variation of its constituent parts. This unity is neither emotional, practical, nor intellectual, for these terms name distinctions that reflection can make within it." End of Dewey quote. In another context, the philosopher re-emphasizes the integrating power of this experiential quality as he writes, "The quality of the whole permeates, affects, and controls every detail," unquote. As we enter a space, the space enters us, and the experience is essentially an exchange and fusion of the object and the subject. Robert Pogg Harrison, the American literary scholar, states poetically, "In the fusion of place and soul, the soul is as much of a container of place as place is a container of soul. Both are susceptible to the same forces of destruction." End of quote. Atmosphere is similarly an exchange between material or existent properties of the place and the immaterial realm of human perception and imagination. Paradoxically, we grasp the atmosphere before we identify its details or understand it intellectually. In fact, we may be completely unable to say anything meaningful about the characteristics of a situation, yet have a firm image, emotive attitude, and recollection of it. In the same way, although we do not consciously analyze or understand the interaction of meteorological facts, we grasp the essence of weather at a glance, and it inevitably conditions our mood and intentionality. As we enter a new city, we grasp its overall character without having consciously analyzed a single one of its countless properties. Dewey even extends this process that advances from an initial but temporary grasp of the whole towards details all the way to our processes of thinking. As he writes, all thought in every subject begins with just such an unanalyzed whole. When the subject matter is reasonably familiar, relevant distinctions speedily offer themselves, and sheer qualitativeness may not remain long enough to be readily recalled. This is an intuitive and emotive capacity that seems to be biologically derived and largely unconsciously and instinctively determined through evolutionary programming. Quote, we perceive atmospheres through our emotional sensibility, a form of perception that works incredibly quickly and which we humans evidently need to help us survive Zumthor success. The new sciences of biopsychology and ecological psychology actually study such evolutionary causalities in human behavior and cognition. It is evident that we are genetically and culturally conditioned to seek or avoid certain types of atmospheres. Our shared pleasure in being in the shadow of large trees looking onto a sunlit open field, for instance, is explained on the basis of such evolutionary programming. This specific type of setting demonstrates the polar notions of refuge and prospect, which, by the way, have been applied to explain the pleasurable nature or feel of Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, for instance. Although atmosphere and mood are overarching qualities of our environments and spaces, these qualities have not been much observed, analyzed, or theorized in architecture. Professor Gernot Böhme is one of the pioneering thinkers in the philosophy of atmospheres, along with Hermann Schmitz. Recent philosophical studies relying on neurological evidence, such as Mark Johnson's The Meaning of the Body, and Iain McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary, significantly valorize the power of the atmosphere. Also, the recent discoveries and further speculations on mirror neurons help to understand how we understand complex entities through embodied simulation. And I think this idea of embodied simulation is extremely important in architectural experience. Atmosphere seems to be a more conscious objective in literary, cinematic, theatrical, and painterly thinking than in architecture. Even the imagery of a painting is integrated by an overall atmosphere or feeling. the most important unifying factor in any painting is usually its specific feel of illumination and color, more than its conceptual or narrative content. In fact, there is an entire painterly approach, as exemplified by J.M.W. Turner and Claude Monet, which can be called atmospheric painting in the two meanings of the notion. Quote, "Atmosphere is my style," unquote, Turner confessed to John Ruskin. The formal and structural ingredients in the works of these artists are deliberately suppressed for the benefit of an embracing and shapeless atmosphere, suggestive of temperature, moisture, and subtle movements of the air. Color field painters similarly suppress form and boundaries for the benefit of intense interaction of color. In today's art, I just want to mention Olafur Eliasson, the Icelandic-Danish architect, artist whose work is especially atmospheric. Also great films, as the films of Jean Vigo, Jean Renoir, Michelangelo Antonioni, and Andrei Tarkovsky, for instance, are steeped in the characteristic atmospheric continuum. Also, theater relies heavily on atmosphere, which supports the integrity and continuity of the story, regardless of the often abstracted and vaguely hinted features of the place or space. The ambience can be so suggestive and dominating that very few cues of the setting are needed, as in Lars von Trier's film Dogville, in which houses and rooms are often indicated by mere chalk lines on the dark floor, but the drama takes a full grip of the spectator's imagination and emotions. Somewhat paradoxically, we can also speak of atmospheric sculpture, such as the sketch-like modeled works of Medardo Rosso, Auguste Rodin, and Alberto Giacometti. Often it is the atmosphere of the individual works, as the abstracted sculptures of Constantin Brancusi, that create the unique sense of a singular artistic world. Artists seem to be more aware of the seminal role of the ambience than architects, who tend to think more in terms of the pure qualities of space, form, and geometry. Atmosphere is judged as something romantic and shallowly entertaining, perhaps. The serious Western tradition is entirely based on seeing architecture as a material and geometric object through focused vision. Besides, standard architectural images seek clarity rather than ephemerality and obscurity. When describing his creative process in the essay The Trout and the Mountain Stream, Alvar Aalto confesses, "Led by my instincts, I draw not architectural syntheses, but sometimes even childish compositions, and via this route, I eventually arrive at an abstract basis to the main concept, a kind of universal substance with whose help the numerous quarreling sub-problems of the design task can be brought into harmony." Aalto's notion, interesting notion here, universal substance, seems to refer to a unifying atmosphere or intuitive feeling rather than any conceptual, intellectual, or formal idea. The instant recognition of the inherent nature of a place is akin to the automatic reading of the creature-like identities and essences in the biological world. Animals instantly recognize other creatures crucial for their survival, either prey or threat. And we humans identify individual faces among thousands of nearly equal facial configurations and recognize the emotive meaning of each face on the basis of minute muscular expressions. A space or a place is an image, a mental or neural creature, a singular experience that is fused with our very existential experience and cognition. Once we have assessed the space inviting and pleasant or uninviting and depressing, we can hardly alter that first-hand judgment. We become attached to certain settings and remain alienated in other kinds of settings. And both intuitive choices are equally difficult to analyze verbally or alter as experiential realities. The existential value of diffuse but comprehensive grasping of the ambience of a spatial entity or an entire landscape can be understood from the point of view of biological survival. It has evidently given us an evolutionary advantage to be instantly able to differentiate a scene of potential danger from a setting of safety and nourishment. Let me repeat, such judgments cannot be consciously deducted from details. They have to be instantaneously grasped as an intuitive reading based on a polyphonic grasp of the ambience. This polyphonic perception and cognition has been identified as one of the conditions for the creative mind. At this point, I wish to suggest that the elementarist idea of perception, imagery, and thought is questionable, if not altogether wrong. An elementarist approach to conceiving architecture as an additive entity of definable and preconceived elements must be equally misguided. Against the common understanding, also creative search is based on vague, polyphonic, and mostly unconscious ways of perception and thought, instead of focused and unambiguous attention. Unconscious and unfocused creative scanning grasps complex entities and processes without conscious understanding of any of the elements, much in the way that we grasp the entities of atmospheres. I wish to underline the fact that we have unexpected synthesizing capacities that we are not usually aware of, and besides which we do not regard as areas of special intelligence and value. The biased focus on rational logic and its value in human mental life is a major reason behind this unfortunate rejection. It is surprising indeed that more than a century after Sigmund Freud's revolutionary discoveries, the prevailing pedagogic philosophies and practices continue to grossly undervalue the entire universe of unconscious and embodied processes. Also, architectural education usually continues to emphasize conscious intentionality along with focused imagery. We have traditionally underestimated the roles and cognitive capacities of emotions in comparison with our conceptual, intellectual, and verbal understanding. Yet, emotional reactions are often the most comprehensive and synthetic judgments that we can produce, although we are hardly able to identify the constituents of these assessments. When we fear or love something, there is not much scope or need for rationalization. Mark Johnson assigns emotions a crucial role in thinking, as he writes, "There is no cognition without emotion, even though we are often unaware of the emotional aspect of our thinking." In his view, emotions are the source of primordial meaning. Emotions are not second-rate cognitions, rather they are affective patterns of our encounter with our world, by which we take the meaning of things at a primordial level. He also points out that emotions are processes of organism-environment interaction, and suggests further that situations are the locus of emotions, not minds or brains. Emotions are not here, they are out there in the human situations. And he concludes, emotions are a fundamental part of human meaning. Our accepted understanding of intelligence is grossly limited. Recent psychological studies have revealed 7 or 10 different categories of intelligence beyond the narrow realm of intelligence measured by the standard IQ test. Howard Gardner lists 7 categories of intelligence: linguistic, logical mathematical, musical, bodily kinesthetic, spatial, interpersonal, and intrapersonal intelligence. Later in his book, he suggests 3 further categories: naturalistic, spiritual, and existential intelligence. I would definitely add the categories of emotional, aesthetic, and ethical intelligence in this list of human cognitive capacities, and I would even suggest atmospheric intelligence as a specific realm of human intelligence. Recent studies on the differentiation of the human brain hemispheres have established that regardless of their essential interaction, the hemispheres have different functions. The left hemisphere is oriented towards the processing of detailed observation and information, whereas the right hemisphere is dominantly engaged in peripheral experiences and the perception of entities. Besides, the right hemisphere is also oriented towards emotional processes, while the left deals with concepts, abstractions, and language. It seems that the recognition of atmospheric entities takes place in a peripheral and subconscious manner, primarily through the right hemisphere. In his challenging and thorough book, Master and His Emissary, on the subject matter of the divided brain, Ian McGilchrist assigns the task of peripheral perception and the integration of the multifarious aspects of experience to the right hemisphere. As he writes, the right hemisphere alone attends to the peripheral field of vision from which new experience tends to come. Only the right hemisphere can direct attention to what comes to us from the edges of our awareness, regardless of the side. So it is no surprise that phenomenologically it is the right hemisphere that is attuned to the apprehension of anything new, end of quote. The right hemisphere, with its greater integration power, is constantly searching for patterns in things. In fact, its understanding is based on complex pattern recognition. McGilchrist also locates contextual understanding, the recognition of configural entities, and emotional judgment in the right hemisphere. As he writes, anything that requires indirect interpretation which is not explicit or literal, that in other words requires contextual understanding, depends on the right frontal lobe for its meaning to be conveyed or received. What the right hemisphere crucially appears to be able to do is to see the configurational aspects of the whole. It is the right hemisphere which gives emotional value to what is seen. Our innate capacity to grasp comprehensive atmospheres and moods is akin to our capacity of imaginatively projecting the emotively suggestive settings of an entire novel as we read it. When reading a great novel, we keep constructing all the settings and situations of the story at the suggestion of the words of the author. And we move effortlessly and seamlessly from one setting to the next, as if they pre-existed as physical realities prior to our act of reading. Indeed, the settings seem to be there, ready for us to enter, as we move from one scene of the text to the next. Remarkably, we do not experience these imaginary spaces as pictures, but in their full spatiality and atmosphere. The same fullness applies to our dreams. Dreams are not pictures, as they are complete spaces and imaginatively lived experiences. Yet they are entirely products of our imagination. The sensory imagery evoked by literature seems to be a kind of an imaginative sensory atmosphere. The processes of literary imagination are discussed in Elaine Scarry's recent book entitled Dreaming by the Book. She explains the vividness of a profound literary text as follows. Quote, "In order to achieve the vivacity of the material world, the verbal arts must somehow also imitate its persistence and most crucially, its quality of givenness. It seems almost certainly the case that it is the instructional character of the verbal arts that fulfills this mimetic requirement for givenness." Bohumil Hrabal, the Czech writer, points out the concreteness of our literary imagination as he writes, "When I read, I don't really read. I pop up a beautiful sentence in my mouth and suck it like liqueur until the thought dissolves in me like alcohol, infusing my brain and heart and coursing on through the veins to the root of each blood vessel." Also, architecture calls for a deepened sense of materiality, gravity, and reality, not an air of entertainment or fantasy. As Constantin Brancusi requests, art must give suddenly, all at once, the shock of life, the sensation of breathing. This sentence by Brancusi is about the most powerful sentence I can give to my students in any school. The power of architecture is in its ability to strengthen the experience of the real, and even its imaginative dimension arises from this strengthened and resensitized sense of reality. Experiencing, memorizing, and imagining spatial settings, situations, and events all engage our imaginative skills. Even the acts of experiencing and memorizing are embodied acts in which lived embodied imagery evokes an imaginative reality that feels similar to actual experience. In every experience, there are two layers. Recent studies that have revealed that the acts of perception and imagining take place in the same areas of the brain, and consequently these acts are closely related. Even perception calls for imagination, as percepts are not automatic products of our sensory mechanisms. Perceptions are essentially creations and products of intentionality and imagination. We could not even see light without our mental inner light and formative visual imagination, as Arthur Jasonk argues. Atmosphere or ambience is an epic experiential dimension or prediction, as we automatically read behavioral and social aspects, either existent, potential, or imaginary, into the atmospheric image. We also read a temporal layering or narrative into the setting, and we appreciate emotionally the layering of temporal traces as well as images of past life in our settings. We like to be connected with signs of life instead of being isolated in hermetic and artificial conditions. Don't we seek historically dense settings because they connect us experientially and imaginatively with past life, and we feel safe and enriched to be part of that temporal continuum? Traces of life support images of safety and generate further images of continued life. We do not judge environments merely by our senses. We also test and evaluate them through our sense of imagination. Comforting and inviting settings inspire our unconscious imagery, daydreams, and fantasies. As Gaston Bachelard argues, the chief benefit of the house is that the house shelters daydreaming. The house protects the dreamer. The house allows one to dream in peace. The house is one of the greatest powers of integration for the thoughts, memories, and dreams of mankind. Herbert Marcuse, the social psychologist, also acknowledges the connection between the atmospheres of settings and our fantasies, as he makes the thought-provoking suggestion that the alarming increase of sexual violence and distorted sexuality today is a consequence of the fact that our modern settings do not stimulate and support erotic fantasies. More often than not, the atmosphere of contemporary cityscapes and dwellings lacks a sensuous and erotic air. We have been taught to conceive, observe, and evaluate architectural spaces and settings primarily as formal and aesthetic entities. Yet, the diffuse overall ambience is often much more decisive and powerful in determining our attitude to the setting. Even buildings and details that hardly possess any aesthetic values manage to create a sensorially rich and pleasant atmosphere. Vernacular settings and traditional towns are examples of pleasant atmospheres, often arising from aesthetically rather uninteresting units. Such urban atmospheres are most often created by specific materiality, scale, rhythm, color, or formal theme with variations. In architectural education, we are usually advised to develop our designs from elementary aspects towards larger entities. But as I have suggested, our perceptions and experiential judgments seem to advance in the reverse manner, from the entity down to details. When experiencing a work of art, the whole gives meaning to the parts, not the other way around. We need to grasp and conceive complete images instead of elements. And in fact, there are no elements in the world of artistic expression. There are only complete poetic experiences intertwined with distinct emotive orientations. As I have pointed out earlier, this view of the primacy of the whole is supported by current findings in the neurosciences. According to the right hemisphere, understanding is derived from the whole, since it is only in the light of the whole that one can truly understand the nature of the parts, McGilchrist asserts. We are mentally and emotionally affected by works of art before we understand them, or indeed, we usually do not understand them at all. I would venture to argue that the greater the artistic work is, the less we understand it intellectually. A distinct mental short-circuiting between the lived and emotive encounter and intellectual understanding is a constitutive character of the artistic experience. This is also the view of Zemir Tseki, one of today's leading neurologists studying the neurological ground of artistic images and effects. He regards a high degree of ambiguity, such as the unfinished imagery of Michelangelo's slaves, or the ambivalent human narratives of Vermeer's paintings, as essential contributors to the greatness of these works. In reference to the great capacity of profound artists to evoke, manipulate, and direct our emotions, Zeki makes the surprising argument, quote, "Most painters are also neurologists. They are those who have experimented upon without ever realizing it, experimented upon and without ever realizing it, understood something about the organization of the visual brain, though with the techniques that are unique to them." Then I ask you to bear with me. I will jump across a few images. The all-encompassing and instantaneous perception of atmospheres calls for a specific manner of perception, unconscious and unfocused peripheral perception. This fragmented perception of the world is actually our normal reality, although we believe that we perceive everything with precision. Our image of the world of perceptual fragments is held together by constant active scanning by the senses, movement, and a creative fusion and interpretation of these inherently dissociated percepts through memory. The historic development of the representational techniques depicting space and form is closely tied to the development of architecture itself. The perspectival understanding of space gave rise to an architecture of vision, whereas the quest to liberate the eye from its perspectival fixation enables the conception of multi-perspectival, simultaneous, and atmospheric space. Perspectival space leaves us as outside observers, whereas multi-perspectival and atmospheric space and peripheral vision enclose and enfold us in their embrace. This is the perceptual and psychological essence of Impressionist, Cubist, and abstract expressionist space. We are pulled into the space and made to experience it as fully embodied sensation and a thick atmosphere. The special reality of a Cézanne landscape, Jackson Pollock painting, as well as of engaging architecture and cityscapes, derives from the way these experiential situations engage our perceptual and psychological mechanisms. As Merleau-Ponty argues, quote, "We do not come to see the work of art, but the world according to the work." While the hectic eye of the camera captures a momentary situation, a passing condition of light, or an isolated, framed and focused fragment, the real experience of architectural reality depends fundamentally on peripheral and anticipated vision. The mere experience of interiority implies peripheral perception. The perceptual realm that we sense beyond the sphere of focused vision is as important as the focused image that can be frozen by camera. In fact, there is evidence that peripheral and unconscious perception is more important for our perceptual and mental system than focused perception. This assumption suggests that one of the reasons why contemporary spaces often alienate us compared with historical and natural settings that elicit powerful emotional engagement has to do with the poverty of our peripheral vision and the consequent weakness of the atmospheric quality. Focused vision makes us mere outside observers, whereas peripheral perception transforms retinal images into a spatial and bodily involvement and gives rise to the sense of an engaging atmosphere and personal participation. Peripheral perception is also the perceptive mode through which we grasp atmospheres. The importance of the senses of hearing, smell, and touch, temperature, moisture, air movement, for the atmospheric perception arises from the essence as non-directional and embracing experiences. The role of peripheral and unconscious perception explains why a photographic image is usually an unreliable witness of true architectural quality. What is outside of the focused frame and even behind the observer's back have as much significance as what is consciously viewed. Indeed, architects would do better if they were less concerned with the photogenic qualities of their works. As neurological understanding suggests, meaning is always contextually grounded. Today's urgent call for an ecologically sustainable architecture also suggests a non-autonomous, fragile, and collaborative architecture adapted to the precise conditions of topography, soil, climate, vegetation, as well as other conditions of the region and site. The potentials of atmosphere, weak gestalt, and adaptive fragility will undoubtedly be explored in the near future in the search of an architecture that will acknowledge the conditions and principles of the ecological reality as well as our own biohistorical nature. I suggest we may well be more interested in atmospheres than individually expressive forms in the future. Understanding atmospheres will most likely teach us about the secret power of architecture and how it can guide entire societies, but at the same time enable us to create our own individual existential foothold. Our capacity to grasp qualitative atmospheric entities of complex environmental situations without a detailed recording and evaluation of their parts and ingredients could well be named our sixth sense. and it is likely to be our most important sense in terms of existence and survival. Thank you. I will gladly try to answer your questions.
Not so much a question, but just an observation about the idea of the atmospheres. I had a rare opportunity once to, the east wing of the National Gallery had a Pollock painting on one wall, and 30 feet away on an opposite wall was a Lee Krasner painting. And they were essentially the same color palette both. In fact, it looked almost as if Pollock had picked up the same cans of paint of color that Krasner had actually painted or filled a brush with to paint her canvas, and he spilled them over the edge of the barn balcony onto his canvas after she finished, I guess. That's what it felt like in a way. But there was an interesting thing. I had the opportunity to walk towards and close to each of the paintings. When I walked towards her painting, there was a sense that every mark, every brushstroke was measured somehow against the brushstrokes near it. You know, just as if a decision was made in that arena, and all these decisions piled up and were spread across the whole page. And when I walked toward her painting, it was wonderful. But it was flat.
Your question is?
It was flat. It was no more than maybe 1.5 inches deep visually. But when I walked to Pollock's painting, the closer I got to it, it was if the marks on the page, the splashes and the drips, they started to move. And they didn't just move laterally in a plane, they moved spatially, three-dimensionally. And it was almost as if I took another step, I'd walk into the painting, into a galaxy of
Do you have a question?
It's not a question, it's an attempt to illustrate, in a sense, the power of this idea of the atmosphere versus the perspective, or the flat image where the only thing is the structure or perspective that gives a sense of depth.
Yes, these phenomena have recently been rather intensely studied in neurosciences, and it is our embodied simulation that makes us read the movement in a painting. That's an unconscious reading. There have been writers who explain that we project parts of ourselves on works of art and architecture and settings, but it seems to really be that it is the embodied simulation that creates this understanding of movement and unconscious repetition of those movements in our muscular system.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it relates to your concept of adaptive fragility.
Yes.
Because the relationship is very tenuous.
Yes. Well, simply, my view is that as Merleau-Ponty beautifully says, we live in the flesh of the world, and we are part of that same flesh. So why would we not react to essences in the flesh outside of us with our own flesh?
Do we have a question? Yeah. There's a microphone coming to you. Just be 1 second.
I think it's one of the things that I found very interesting in your book, The Thinking Hand, was the notion that our body is part of our thinking process, and that when working with our body, there are millions of years of evolution of intelligence that are embedded in that. And I think the thing that you mention as a kind of difficulty of our time is our growing reliance on computers and the kind of primitive relationship of that to our body being only, 2 decades old or something. And I was wondering if you can imagine how that could quickly develop to catch up or help us with our dependence on this tool that doesn't seem to be able to let us express ourselves as smartly as we can in other tools.
Yes, there is quite a lot of evidence that thinking processes are much wider and deeper embodied processes than we have assumed so far. And that, I think, is very essential for education, for instance. And that touches upon the idea of the use of the computer. I'm of the opinion that, of course, we need computers, and they have enabled things that we could not imagine without them. But we need to be taught to imagine before we start to use computers, because it is the embodied imaginative processes that are fantastic in human beings. And that realm is the real source of creative thought also.
Next question? Yeah.
Are there architects working today that you think have a particularly good sense of what this thesis you're trying to develop?
Yes, I would say my colleague sitting next to Kenneth here, Stephen, is very conscious of these things, even in his writings. I would say yes, yes. On the other hand, I can sincerely say that creative talent does not very strongly depend on intellectual capacities of understanding. So sometimes a theoretical engagement can become a problem for an individual. I know it in my own case that I have developed almost a schizophrenic double personality. One person designs and the other one criticizes. If the two are one and the same, nothing comes out of design process.
So feel free to ask your question to either personality. Somebody way in the front.
Hi, I have here I'll just go forward. I was wondering, how does the atmosphere of our immediate physical environment, say the atmosphere of a building, relate to the symbolic environment? For example, the fact that the buildings around us are situated in a nation, and a nation that is at war. Because while you could debate about whether atmospheres are ontologically political...
The microphone breaks your sound, so I can't understand.
All right. Because while you could debate about whether atmospheres are ontologically political, historically, architecture as a physical manifestation of politics, our atmospheres risk concealing or naturalizing these politics. So while I'm seduced and excited by the vision of architecture you present, I'm also concerned about a work which suspends us in a world of physical perception, but might isolate us from the world of symbols. How the fact that I'm worried about a work that stuns us into suspension and isolation in the real when we remain active participants in reality. So I'm wondering, how might atmospheres be appropriated as a progressive force in reality?
I'm not sure I understand your question completely, particularly the use of the notion political. My notion of political is from the late 1960s. And
I'm referring to political in the sense of le politique rather than la politique. The politics we read about in the newspaper, the fact that we're at war.
I still have difficulties grasping your question enough to give an intelligent question. I would, if you wouldn't mind, sending your question as an email to me, and I will answer you in writing, because I don't want to just assume what you said. I want to understand.
If I understand the question, it relates to if you immerse yourself in an atmospheric work in the ways that you describe, do you disconnect yourself from other things? For example, your political relationship, the society you're in, and things like this. So it's almost could be reframed as a question: what is the relationship between atmosphere and politics?
Yeah.
Well, atmospheres exist regardless of whether anyone has intended them or not. But then there are also atmospheres that are highly intentional. For instance, the commercial designers know these issues much better than we architects know today. So, as anything else, they can be used for manipulative and liberating purposes, and that's an ethical issue. My view of art and architecture is very strongly that these arts have to defend the autonomy of the individual and his or her experience of the world. So I support fully an architecture, atmospheric or otherwise, that liberates our thoughts and feelings. And that's usually the case with any great profound art, that it does so. Think of poetry, for instance.
Next question? Yeah.
Do you have a method for teaching students how to create atmosphere? Do you have a method?
Pardon me?
Do you have a method for teaching your students how to create atmosphere?
Yes. When I teach nowadays, I pay attention to it, and I try to read it myself and make students, enable them to read the atmospheric entity, which is another attention almost entirely than formal attention. I think if a formal attention tends to kill the atmospheric essence of things. Well, the idea of atmosphere simply it's nothing new. It is just recognizing that there are aspects in settings, spaces, architecture, artworks that cannot be approached through standard formal analysis and intellectual analysis. They come through other channels, and my main point really is to emphasize the importance of peripheral, unfocused vision, which has hardly been theorized at all for architecture and architectural education. But it is so simple that by definition, when we see something in focus, we are outsiders to that object. Only with peripheral vision are we pulled into a space. So it's a very simple observation.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Do you think that this idea of atmosphere in a space, do you think it can also convey specific messages or meanings, like forms or volumes can?
Yes, I would say yes. Architectural meanings are existential and lived meanings anyway. They are different from verbal and intellectual meanings. The meaning in architecture arises from the experiential situation rather than something that is given by the architect. So I see no reason why this would not be the case.
Just to the right of the column there.
You mentioned that atmospheric paintings are in two modes. Will you describe the two modes that are involved?
What was that?
Yeah, you mentioned that atmospheric paintings are in two modes. What are the two modes?
Two modes. I don't think I said that. I gave certain examples of atmospheric paintings.
Just a misunderstanding. It's okay. You have somebody next door who had a question?
I was just curious if you found any productive collaborations between architects and neuroscientists or cognitive scientists that have altered the discourse in either field. I know you've obviously read tremendously and studied deeply in it, but I'm wondering if it's gone the other way at all.
Again, I could hardly hear you.
Did you catch it?
But
Oh, sorry. I was asking if architecture has, in your experience, contributed in any way to the study of consciousness for the field of, so collaborations between architects and neuroscientists or cognitive scientists or practitioners in those fields, have they found something in architecture that they can draw on to expand the discourse between the fields from that side?
well, now the kind of neurological studies that I'm referring here are rather new because they depend on the technologies of localizing brain functions in the brain, and they are not that old. I would say the time has come for us to start a conversation with neurologists, and there are several neuroscientists who are extremely well read in philosophy and art history, and also seem to understand architecture. Antonio Damasio and Zemir Zeki, just to mention two. I will have a chance to have lengthy conversations with Antonio Damasio next fall, and I'm looking forward to that. I would say altogether that it is very important, essential, I would say, to our profession to have an active conversation with different kinds of artists and craftsmen and philosophers and scientists. I have myself gained so much out of that, and I'm sure that nobody would object to this. But there is a tendency to sort of move around with one's colleagues. I always advise my students to seek friends among artists and craftsmen, because that gives another view of the world.
So maybe this is a good point to finish. When reading you the list of the names of not all, but many of the books of the last decade, I didn't mention the number of writings that you've done about fellow architects, whether historical or contemporary, and artists, which is almost as much as the books I described. It happened that the lecture you gave came right out of the thread of those books of the last 10 years. But this writing about your colleagues is, of course, one other thing that connects you to the work of Kenneth. And this sort of generosity to history and to your colleagues, as it were, in the field is very, very crucial in the work. For many of you in the room who know Juhani's work will recognize that he's pulling a thread further than before on certain aspects of the thinking before. So, of course, in the moment of asking questions, it's almost impertinent. It might be especially impertinent to ask for a very precise explanation of the periphery, which is by definition outside. It was, of course, Walter Benjamin that made the important observation that for most human beings, architecture is always experienced peripherally and only peripherally, which is to say it's not experienced as such. And the architects as a species suffer from the dilemma of actually trying to look at it directly. So I think in a way the lecture tonight was a very beautiful, eloquent call to sort of cultivate sensitivity and respect for that which lies beyond the vision of the architect. So not just the image that's very beautiful, but also the way of thinking. And I think it was a very wonderful way to honor Kenneth and this particular line of inquiry. So I would really invite the audience to celebrate both Kenneth and Juhani for thinking and making us think. And I think there are many, many questions in this room that hopefully don't get answered. But we will all I hope, have a drink tonight, and that drink should be for Kenneth.